So for this sample, I'm going to show a few different finishing techniques. The first one, instead of tying knots or using the hem stitch, I'm showing you how to use a back stitch with a needle and thread to secure the end, and then you can fold it under and sew it again. So what I'm doing is going through the second spot where the warp and the weft meet, and going from the back to the front. I have a threaded needle with a knot in the end, and so I go in there, and now I go back to the left and around to the next spot where the warp and the weft intersect. So the thread is going up on top, underneath, and up through the back. And I'm using black thread right now just to make it more visible. Now I'm going to go back down into where that first stitch went into and go underneath. So you can see I bring my needle through the back side and back up around here. So this is called a back stitch. This could also be done just on a sewing machine. If you have a sewing machine, you can just sew right across. So I stitch backwards, and then when I go forward, I go past where my last stitch was to bring the needle through from the back to the front. Now I go into just past where my needle went in before, from the front to the back. And I just keep this pattern going all the way across the weaving. And notice I'm sewing right into the warp and the weft where they intersect. So I'm sewing right along here is where the weft is, and I want to make sure to sew along there so I actually secure the weaving. So one part of my thread was pulled and the other wasn't, so I'm just untangling it because I've doubled my thread. Now at the end I have this loop, and I just put my needle through that loop. I'm doing that again, so I've gone off my weaving with my needle, and now as I'm pulling, there's a loop here. I want to bring my needle through one time and again to knot my stitch. So I've stitched all the way across. If I want to be extra diligent, I can stitch back again just to make sure I really have all of these threads secured. And I might just run a running stitch which goes up and in, just to make sure I really have all of this weaving secured. If this was a project I was working on, not just a demo, I would go ahead and back stitch again across. I'm going to cut all the fringe off after, so I really want to make sure the stitch secures all of the woven threads in place. Okay, so I have the loop at the edge of the weaving. Now everything is trimmed. I've cut everything I have. So you can see right across one of the wefts where the warp and the weft intersect, I sewed along there. Now I'm just taking my scissors and I'm cutting all the fringe off. So I will fold this over now and sew this to the back of the weaving so I have a very nice clean edge on the front side. So you can either fold it over once or you can fold it over twice, depending on how much bulk you want on the side. And I think for the today I'm just going to fold it over twice. It's a little bit easier to sew when it's folded over twice because I have a clean edge here. If I was going to sew it folded over once, I have to go up and catch into that area where I secured it. So I'm just going to fold it and sew it over twice, fold it over twice and sew it. This is also something, if you were going to put Velcro on the back of your weaving, you could sew the Velcro onto the front side of the weaving and then fold it over like this. So there would be a piece of Velcro right here. And then you can see the front of the weaving will not show the Velcro on the back, and the Velcro can then be secured to another piece of Velcro on the wall to hang it. So I'm folding this over twice, and then I'm going to do a whip stitch to stitch this into place. So now I'm going to do a whip stitch to get my thread to secure the folded over edge of my weaving. So you can see I have a needle, it's threaded. It's I put the thread through double and then knotted the end. And I like doing a double threaded needle or double thickness of thread just because it's a little bit stronger. So I have this area where I sewed with the back stitch, fold it over, and I'm using the weft as a guide. This weaving is not the nicest woven, so it's a little bit difficult. So now what I'm doing is I want to make sure all of my stitches stay on the back side. So I'm using this line here where the weft went in and the warp, and I'm just catching part of it. So I'm using a black thread for the purpose of a demo to show you, but if I were doing this on a weaving that wasn't a demo, I would use the same color thread. So you can see I have my needle going through the warp and the weft, and I'm cutting right into the middle of it. So if I flip it to the front side, you don't see any needle or any thread coming through. Now I'm going to catch the edge of the warp and the weft right here on the folded part. So I'm following along this area here. Make sure my thread is pulled tight. So I went from the base of the weaving, the back of the weaving, into the folded part. So I went underneath and up and out. Now I'm going to move over one stitch or one line of the weaving and going back up into the folded part on the next line. So I'm just using the warp and the weft as markers of where I should stitch into. And I'll be doing this all the way across the weaving. And I'm using the weft that was woven as a line for where to sew. And I want to double check and flip it over and make sure I can't see that thread on the front side. I'm really making sure that my needle goes directly into the thread. So you can see on the side here, this is really loosely woven. So I have to be a little bit more careful that I keep the thread on the back side and you can't see through it on the front side. Okay, so I've stitched all the way across and now I'm just going to stitch back a few stitches. So the same motion of going into the weaving from the base of the cloth into the folded part. And this just helps secure the weaving. Okay, now as I pull it, I'm just taking my needle through the loop and I'll tie a knot here. I just don't want a knot on the edge of the weaving. So I can clip that knot there. And now you can see the front of the weaving is finished without having any kind of fringe. You don't see that thread stitched through. I can also take the edges here and sew the back right along here. I can sew it to the front of this. This was one of my first samples, so the quality is not great, but you can see even if you have some mistakes, you just have to be a little bit more careful when you're fixing the weaving. So that is a finished edge of the weaving. Again, if you wanted to have Velcro on the back side, before you fold it over, you would just have a bigger piece, sew the Velcro to the front, fold it over, and then do the same method of stitching.